In today's video, we're going to be talking about some mistakes that you might be making with basic watercolor techniques. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle. On this channel, we do all things watercolor. We also do all things drawing and lots of mixed media, even some motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. At time of filming this, I'm almost at 150,000 subscribers, so it would really help me out, and subscribing is completely free. So today we're going to talk about basic watercolor techniques and some of the mistakes that I see people making. Now, most of you know that before I was on YouTube, I taught a ton of classes, and since the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of online courses. Now, my most basic foundational watercolor course is a complete beginner's basic techniques course. So one of the reasons I'm making this video is that at the moment that course is on sale, but I'll tell you more about that later. First of all, we're going to look at techniques. So the first thing that my course starts with is actually a flat wash. Now, why do I consider a flat wash to be so important? In fact, it's the first three modules, various iterations and ideas around a flat wash. Now, you don't have to do a flat wash that often in a watercolor painting, but to me, it's the most important and the first technique that you really should master. In essence, it's incredibly simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy, as I'm sure you found out if you've tried to do one. The reason I'm so keen on you getting to grips with a flat wash is because if you can apply watercolor paint evenly across a large area without drying lines, backruns, and strange unevenness going on, you can pretty much do anything, and all of the other techniques will be much easier to master. So let's start with one of the mistakes that I see people making with a flat wash. So one of the main mistakes I see people make with a flat wash is not mixing up enough paint. And it's not really the problem of the paint, it's the problem of the palette. So it comes with using palettes like this or other small palettes. Now, there are much better options, and the difficulty with not mixing up enough paint is you then run out, obviously you run out halfway across, and then you have to stop and you've got to mix more paint up. We've got several problems with this. First of all, this is going to start drying, and we've then got wetter paint. Is it even, the same dilution? Perhaps it's a little bit wetter or drier. Perhaps it's got more or less pigment in, or more or less water. And what's going to happen is we're going to get an uneven result. You can see the second half I'm doing is much lighter. And as it starts to dry, we're going to be able to see this area where I started and stopped, and it will likely become much more apparent. The more it dries, the more this edge will start to show a drying line and a back run. You can see it happening already. So how do you make sure you mixed enough paint? There are many things you can do. You can use a palette with much larger wells like this one here. I actually like to use a separate little pot. You can also use tube paint. That'll enable you to mix more up, but you certainly can use pan paint. You might have to scrub at it a bit, so you might want to use an old paintbrush or even an acrylic paintbrush that's really going to pick up that paint. And you're going to choose some kind of large pot. So I've got this one here. This just had some kind of a condiment in, or perhaps something from a takeaway I ordered. This one here is just a little ceramic dish. You can get these from kitchenware shops. You can also find them in thrift stores and charity shops very cheaply indeed. I'm always on the lookout for little white dishes. And we're going to start by mixing up more. Now, if you've got a very strong colour with a lot of pigment in, you might even want to tip clean water in first and mix from there. So you can see how bad this first result has been. Next, I'm going to mix up more paint and try again. So I started with clean water and I applied my paint into the water. I've got a fairly large brush and I've mixed up, a lot more paint than I think I need. And that's particularly important with a very large area. So if you're doing something like a sky, you can find that, even just one of those huge paintbrushes can almost eat up all of the paint in your palette. So we mix up far more than we think that we need. We're using quite a large brush so we can get across the area quickly. And what we need to do is to keep this leading edge wet. So it doesn't matter if this area over here starts to dry, as long as this edge here that we're painting across with remains wet. And when we get to the end here, it's important to get rid of any puddles. So what I've got some paper towel. I'm going to start now dabbing my brush just so that I don't leave any puddles. And in this way, we'll get a lovely, even, flat wash. Once you've mastered your flat wash, you're going to want to master a graduated wash. This is where the paint starts dark and fades out to white. It's usually done with the dark at the top. It can be done in either direction, but honestly, people use it most often for skies. And this is because something called aerial perspective makes everything in the distance, in other words, down by the horizon, seem much lighter and much more faded. This technique in many ways is a little bit easier than a flat wash, but there is one mistake that I see people make time and time again. So let's sort that out right now. So one of the biggest mistakes I see with a graduated wash is something I call pigment bleed. So I'm starting here at the top with a very strong colour. This is Prussian blue and it's what they call a staining colour for obvious reasons. So I get about halfway down and then I'm going to start adding some clean water in. But I've dipped my paintbrush, but I haven't bashed it around. I haven't got it, completely free of paint. And then I'm going to start sort of spreading. And before you know it, and I'll rinse my brush a little bit better this time and apply sort of pretty much clean water. But I haven't got control of my water levels. It's all quite drippy and, I'm just ending up spreading the paint all the way down. Now it's looking a bit uneven, so I'm going to try and even it out a bit. And before you know it, you've completely lost control of your graduated wash, which, although it's a little darker at the top, it was supposed to fade out to white paper, and I've completely spread the pigment all the way down, and I haven't got that nice white fade out that I wanted. So let me show you an easy way of dealing with this. So let's try it again. We're going to start in exactly the same way, putting that strong paint at the top like so, making sure I've got lots of nice dark paint up the top of my paper, but I'm already getting about a third of the way down and I'm in danger of spreading that pigment too far again. I'm going to completely clean my paintbrush. And I'm going to start lower down this time with clean water, and I'm going to bring the clean water up to the area I painted, drying my brush a little bit so that we control that paint. I'm going to clean my brush again and dry it because I don't want any pigment on it as I work down the bottom here. And I'm spreading up the clean water to meet the paint. And here's the result, a beautiful graduated wash. So we've looked at fading paint out over a large area, but what if you just want to fade out a little edge? Have you seen those pretty paintings where people have petals and you get some dark paint and it fades in a blended edge out to nothing? That can be quite hard to do, at least if you don't know the right way of doing it. So the way that I see people trying to do this is really making it much harder. I've got a simple way of doing it. In fact, there are several ways of doing this depending on the circumstance and the type of painting that you're doing, but I'm going to show you the easiest one today. So I've drawn a petal here. This is a white petal, but it's got a blush of pink down this side. So I'm going to get some of this really lovely permanent rose and I'm going to start painting here, and I'm going to start trying to blend this out to clean paper. So this is where I see people go wrong. I'm going to show you another way of doing this in a moment that's going to be more successful for you. And what happens is people get to about here and then they rinse their brush and get some clean water and they start trying to sort of blend this edge. Not only have we got all sorts of uneven drying going on here, but the pigment is immediately going to that wet area. So let's rinse a bit more and, try and blend this out a bit more. And you tend to end up either by spreading the pigment right the way across the petal, as we did with the sky, or you just end up with this very uneven result. And even though the paint's a little lighter, you have got a hard edge along here that you rarely see on flower petals. It's not terrible, but I think we can do a little better. So I'm going to show you another method. This time we're going to put clean water right the way across our petal. Now, with all of these methods I'm showing you, there's more than one way of doing this, and you certainly can blend out an edge when you've painted on dry paper like we were doing just now. It's not impossible to get that right, but this way is a little easier. So in my beginner's course, I do show you both ways of doing it, simply because you may forget to wet the petal first like I'm showing you here, or there may just be a time when you didn't realize you wanted to blend an edge. You've already painted on dry paper and you want to get it done. So I do show you both ways, but this is the simplest one. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get my pink paint, fairly dry paint. Now, the wetter the paint is, the more of this bleeding and feathering you'll get, which does happen on some petals, particularly things like lilies. but this is a rose petal, so I'd really rather have a bit more of a blended result. So I'm going to rinse and dry my brush so that I've got a little bit more even water levels going on there. I don't have to worry I'm going to get any kind of hard edge along here because we've got water all the way to the edge of the petal. And I can even, if I want to, drag that colour up wherever I see it. But I'll be careful not to work on this too long. So if we compare with the first one, it didn't look too bad at first, but look at this hard edge we've got now. This won't happen with our second version. At this point in the video, can I just pause for a moment to ask you if you could just click that like button, that thumbs up. If you can like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, all of those things are completely free. They will help to push this video out to more people. If you're enjoying learning about these basic techniques, let me tell you about my Complete Beginners course. It covers all of the techniques that we've done today and more in far more depth than I've ever had time to go into here. There are, for example, about 20 things that could affect how well your flat wash applies. That course is on sale at the moment. So if you're watching this video and it's just come out, that course is on sale until 4th of March 2024. There's quite a big discount available. You don't need any kind of discount code or coupon code for this particular one. Just click the link in the video description. I'll pop it in the pinned comment as well. You can have a look at the course. You're not committing to anything just by clicking that link. You can read all of the curriculum, all of the reviews, and see if it's right for you. Now let's get back to today's video. Now, sometimes we just want to paint wet paint on dry areas. In other words, we want some sort of crisp linear marks. We might be painting some kind of a grid or bricks. We might be painting text on a sign or something like that. Seems like a really easy thing to do, but there is one mistake that people make with this that does get them into a little bit of trouble. I'm going to show you the mistake and, of course, the solution. I've drawn a grid on this paper. You can imagine it to be perhaps some window frames or trellis on top of a fence or anywhere where you need to make marks on top of dry paper. I've got some sepia here mixed with some water to give a nice wood effect. So what's the best way of approaching this? Now, what people would normally do, which would seem to be the most logical, is to paint maybe the uprights or the horizontals first and then go back and put the lines across the other way. So let's do that and see what the problem is. I am not, by the way, being too accurate with my painting today. Don't pick me up on that. I'm extremely short-sighted and I wear varifocals, so I'd be very happy placing my face, about an inch from the paper, but you wouldn't be able to see very well if I did that, would you? Just see the top of my head, lots of hair. Okay, so what happens here is that this first layer starts to dry, and you can see it may not dry evenly. Some of them may have a bit less paint on, may start drying quicker. And then when we go to paint in the other direction, we've got that intersection between areas of paint that may be wet or may be drier. And although it may look okay at first, I guarantee that in at least one place where these intersections happen, we're going to get some drying lines. And they're not going to be neat either because the wet paint and the dry paint will bleed between areas. So this is starting to dry now, and look what's happening around these intersections. We're getting these bleed lines and we're getting uneven drying because the first layer had started to dry as we place the second layer across. I'm going to show you two ways now of fixing this problem. So the first way of fixing this problem is not to paint it in a traditional way. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to try and keep that leading edge moving like we did with those flat and graduated washes. So I'm going to come around this first square like this. We've got two directions now. So we're going down in this direction, but we're also going down in this direction. So, it can be a little bit fiddly, and you might want to divide this up. If this was a huge grid, you might want to sort of divide this up and, work in half of it or quarter of it and then do the rest. So I'm coming down, but I'm going in different directions at once, and I'm keeping all of this paint here moving so that I'm not taking wet paint over paint that's, slightly drier, and coming down and painting the whole thing almost in one go, being careful to avoid leaving puddles at the ends. And here we'll get a much more even drying. A second way of doing it is to do the cross slats first, so either horizontal or vertical, it doesn't matter, and then to put the second layer over the top. Now this will give you a double layer as one crosses the other, and so you will get darker paint on those squares where they intersect. But it will be neat and it won't bleed everywhere, so it's up to you to decide if that's something that you're happy with, and you can come across like this and down, and where we intersect across that bottom layer, we're not going to get bleeding, we're just going to get a slightly darker area. And honestly, there may be some occasions where the thing you're looking at actually does that, if it's semi-transparent, or where you're just quite happy for it to look that way. And here I come across that underneath dry layer with my cross slats. Either one of these two methods will give you a much neater result than the first one. You can see how unevenly it's dried. So for that last one, we were just painting on top of ordinary dry paper. What about if you want to paint on top of another layer of paint? There's a major mistake that people get wrong with this one. Let's fix it right now. Now I've painted some Daniel Smith green gold on this patch here. It's a very beautiful colour. I want to put some paint next to it and on top of it, and I want that paint to be nice and crisp edged and let it dry. And honestly, this is one of the mistakes that I've seen the most often. It used to happen in my art classes so frequently. It's probably the biggest mistake that people make, and that's not letting things get dry enough before painting either on top of them or next to them. And you can see, although that paint didn't look very wet, it's still absolutely soaking. And this area down the bottom here, you know, it looks fairly dry. Let's try painting a nice straight edge here. It's not bad, is it? It's fairly okay, but there are one or two areas here where it's still wet and it's bleeding in. And that's the same patch of paint. It's just been a little bit wetter towards the top here because of how the paper is bowing. That's one reason why I always stretch my paper when working on my own work. So let's have a look here. Well, we've got a nice sharp edge here, but where the paint is wet here, it's bleeding and it's attracted to that damp area. I can't tell you how many times I walked around an art class and said to somebody, make sure that area is dry before you paint next to it. And the students say, oh yes, don't worry, Michelle, I'm going to do that. I've got other bits to paint. I'll let that dry. And then I would walk back around, and honestly, it was absolutely hilarious because people would actually say to me, I know what you said, Michelle, but I just couldn't help myself. I had to do it anyway. And they would have ruined, you know, part of their painting. We'd have to try and fix it. Now, although that can happen in real classes, it also happens with online tutorials, because every artist that you follow on YouTube edits their videos. We have to, otherwise they'd be, 15 hours long. And so it's really easy when an artist says to you, make sure that area is dry before you paint next to it. And then they say something like, I'm going to let this area dry now. We'll come back to that in a minute. And you might think to yourself, okay, I'll let that area dry. Maybe 10, 15 minutes is enough. But is it? It's not always. Now, sometimes that may be enough. And I can't give you a formula, an amount of time that you need to let your work dry. And that's because it really depends on the humidity and the heat and the weather conditions where you are, depending on how long you should let things dry for. So you can see this second patch here I painted this morning, and we have much better results. I'm also helping the matter by going across with fairly thick paint. The wetter your paint is, in other words, the more water to pigment, the more likely it is to bleed. And if you do get bleeding on a dry area of paper, either with or without an underneath layer of paint, if you put paint onto bone dry paper and it bleeds, that usually means that the sizing has come off of the paper, either because it's been wet too many times, you've over soaked it before stretching. I have a video that's going to show you a much quicker method of stretching paper without long soaking times, which just take the sizing and the coating off of your paper. I'll leave that in the description of this video. Or sometimes it can just be that there's a manufacturer's fault or the paper's really old. So if you get bleeding on dry paper, there's something wrong with the paper. Let's look at the difference here between the one that wasn't dry properly and the one that was dry. There may even be occasions when it's best to let your paper dry overnight. So do let me know in the comments if you've made any of these mistakes. If you have any other problems with basic techniques, I'd also like to know what other videos you'd like to see on this channel. Awful lot of you have come in from drawing and watercolor pencils, which is super exciting. So do let me know what type of videos you'd like to see on this channel. Of course, I won't be stopping the watercolor content because it's my absolute favorite medium. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. Lots of free stuff down there that you can grab for no money whatsoever. Some free downloadable PDFs, even a free watercolor course that you can take. Now, watercolor techniques are all very well, but if you haven't got your drawing right, it can be a waste of time because we all need that correct underdrawing, even if it's just a few lines. I'm going to put up one of my most popular drawing videos for you right now. Don't be intimidated by drawing. You don't have to learn it all at once. You can start by learning just a few simple drawing tips.